Firstly, guys, diversity and inclusion. One of mine that I'm running, and I've been sort of reflecting on the conversation, and if we include, it struck me that we're including more and more things, rightly so, in diversity. We're talking about neurodiversity. We're talking about health, either permanent or temporary health conditions. So we're talking about an awful lot of things. It struck me as I was thinking about it yesterday that we're no longer talking about others. It's more talking about us. We're almost get to the point where everybody is included in this at some point during their career, if not permanently. So it was really interesting for me to see that, to think about that. Another thing was treating people how they want to be treated, not how you would be treated. I know, Stuart, both of us have had that as a running thought in our conversations for quite some time. Then we moved on to employee brand, and I think Stuart's got some thoughts about employee brand, but also then labelling, Maria, which I thought was really interesting. How we're labelling people or labelling ourselves was interesting. Stuart, employee brand. What are your sort of reflections on that since our discussions?
I guess some people are pretty good at it in terms of selling a brand that is a true representative to actually how they are. Others less good at selling it, and others almost don't really understand what employer brand really means. So I think it's a whole mismatch. And if you look, especially around it with diversity inclusion, some of the best practices. I mean, there are companies out there with outreach that really are trying to differentiate themselves to be, truly inclusive. And in fact, one I can think of had a strapline as the safe place to work, which I think is a really interesting thing around how you can attract a really diverse workforce, knowing that people are going to be respected as the individuals that they are in that workplace, right? But that takes a huge amount to build it internally, individually, organizationally, before you can establish a brand that is known for it, right? And then that's where you can start to differentiate your attraction and retention strategies.
And it's interesting, isn't it? We had a bit of a conversation around there's nothing wrong with having an aspirational brand in this field, especially. And I do agree with you. I think that's a really good thing. And I think other companies perhaps don't understand, or there's some confusion about your brand and your employee brand. So is your company brand something different to your employee brand? Should it be? Could it be? All those things I think people really need to be looking at in a bit more depth around that. Maria, we had a conversation about labelling. Now, it's an interesting one that we tend to label groups, but increasingly we're labelling ourselves. And I thought it was late on within that discussion, but I thought it's a really interesting subject, and one that's only just becoming relevant, I guess, now. Well, tell me a bit of your thoughts on that since the conversation.
Well, I, as someone that's sort of worked in digital space for quite a while, have been aware of movements around the sort of quantified self. So the idea that you would use technology to quantify your health, from wearing a Fitbit to measure your steps or your heart rate, to quantifying activities that you do, and reflecting on some of the great topics that were discussed in the Explore session that we had. It just occurred to me that we were sort of starting to stretch this out into other parts of ourselves, our personality, or how our brains work, that we could start to perhaps codify in some form, not in terms of a software or digital form, but labeling to me is some sort of like codification of ourselves. And it just, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing yet.
This is what struck me about it, Maria. The whole issue of labelling. A lot of us do a lot of work in coaching, and we're trying to, in some cases, break down the labels that people have given themselves and understand those labels. Some of it's good, some of it's not. So I think as we get more into this subject, I think that's a good route to go down, to be honest, because we tend to label groups and then bunch them into groups around disabilities, around needs and preferences, but people also label themselves, and that then becomes something different, I think. So
I think the interesting thing there, Karen, as part of the conversation we had, was that it's obviously intuitively the right thing to do to be truly inclusive and have people from all labels or non-labels, however you want to do it. But actually, most of the labels people sort of count are sort of physical attributes, gender, ethnicity, age, things like that.
Yeah.
When you talk to what's the value of the value in a corporate sense is often the diversity of thought, the neurodiversity, right, in its broadest context. And yet we don't tend to evaluate or attract or think about our strategies for actually gaining different thought styles and experience, do we? And actually is that and is there a correlation between the more physical attributes to the thought styles, and then how do we really get behind the differentiation of thought, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. Sorry, Maria. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great point, Stuart, and I think it goes back to the first point that was made around, which Mike has also listed in the comment, which is around treating. If we can understand how people want to be treated themselves, and we do that through labeling or codification of that person, is that a good thing? Like, maybe it is, maybe this sort of because that's sort of where we're trying to get to at the end of the day, isn't it? Is for people to feel that they can come to work and do great work, as we all want to do as humans, in a way that allows us to be ourselves.
Codivation of people, Maria. We're gonna have to spend some time on that one. We're gonna have to work out how that fits into this world of AI and robotics and things. But seriously, there is something in there, isn't there, about that? How do we identify the needs of people and the strengths of people, especially as we get into the more complex neurodiversity, which I guess at the end of the day, that's what companies are really after. I agree with you, Stuart. They're after that richness in thoughts, opinions, approaches to things. If you've got a different approach, you want a team that has different approaches to the same subject, then you get different answers. Okay, guys, that's great. That diversity will continue. We'll soon have another session up on the website. So if you want to join that, by all means, if you're on LinkedIn, send us a message and we can include you on that. Operational resilience, Stuart. This is your baby. We've got a couple of sessions coming up. How are things developing? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it was a topic suggested to us, and rightly so. I mean, and anybody offering services, there's nothing more frustrating as a customer when the service ceases, either in part or in whole. Right? It is truly a moment of trust and reflection for both customer and the business, right? And yet, most of in my experience, and I've been a COO and a CTO, I mean, in my experience, most companies focus on more recovery than actually resilience. They don't really, measure how resilient they are. They look at how good they are at recovering from failure. And interestingly, most of that tends to be orientated towards technology. Does our technology stand up? And if it fails, how do we recover from a technology failure? And again, understandably so, we're highly dependent on technology. But I'm interested in more, the true definition of operational resilience, which is, how do you maintain your services operationally? And how resilient are they? How do you even measure resilience as opposed to recovery. Yeah, because I don't think it's necessary the definition of how mean time between failures of your service. Yeah, I think there's many other ways to measure how resilient you are, both from a people or organization, a process, and ultimately a service perspective. And operationally, this is quite tough to do, especially if you're very technology orientated. It means that your people are probably not servicing a fraction of the overall service as a whole level, and therefore when things go wrong, your ability to maintain operational capabilities are severely hampered, right? And again, there's different strategies to how you handle this, and I'm really looking forward to exploring how companies deal with this operational resilience. How do they measure resilience? How do they know if they've got a resilient organization or not? How do they deal with what are their vulnerabilities, and how do they deal with these circumstances? And so it's the meeting next meeting's on the 28th at 10 o'clock in the morning, 90 minutes. And it's really to explore that subject. We have some great people already attending, but again, there's always room for more. So if people want to come and join the conversation, I'm really looking forward to people's views.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart, and top marks for having the date at hand during the live session. Top marks there. I was thinking about it actually from having a conversation with the utility sector early in the week. Their view on resilience is very different, especially talking about gas services. They built their whole reputation around operational resilience, and it's not. We sort of looked at it from a technology point of view before, but I wonder if we ought to try and get that sector involved, because they do have a different approach to it, which is interesting. And some of it's associated with safety, but most of it is associated with just keeping the lights on or just keeping the gas flowing. So those organisations are really they have a slightly different mindset on the whole thing, which would be interesting. So thank you for that, Stuart. Yeah, we're looking forward to those sessions. So Maria, rebooting digital this Friday.
This Friday, yeah.
What time is 8 o'clock? Is it
10 o'clock? 8 o'clock.
I was going to say, I thought you said 8 o'clock. I'll set the alarm. I'm sorry, what coffee?
8 o'clock.
So 8 o'clock on Friday is the first session on here. What are your thoughts? How are things progressing?
Well, I mean, this topic came about because I read an article about a city council that had brought in some technology in order to do a digital transformation of their business. And halfway through the project, they'd realized that they couldn't change the people and their ways of working to the technology that they brought in. So they then flipped the project to try and bend the technology to the will of the rituals and the ways of working within their organization. And it was a disaster, and it cost them millions of pounds more. It extended the project by about 3 years. And I started to speak to people about it in my network. And then whenever I mentioned digital transformation, everybody just looked at me like they wanted to set fire to their own faces. And I kind of thought, well, there's something here then that we need to sort of get under the hood of a bit, what is going on? And when I sort of sat back and thought about it, I dug out an old presentation that I'd done in 2016, where the Institute of Project Management had said that, they'd given this stat out, digital transformation failure rate was at around 70%. And this was been like eight years ago. And I thought, well, the barriers of technology barriers to get into technology are much lower.
Yeah.
We're all a lot more experienced at doing this stuff. There's so much more information out there. But looking at recent stats, that failure rate seems to be stuck at around that 70% mark. And it's just a really interesting question to me to try and explore, use Friday's session to start to explore how people feel about it, why there's this feeling about it, what works, what doesn't, and why we seemingly haven't moved forward in 8 years.
And I think it's spot on, Maria, because you know, a lot of the people I'm working with, in one form or another, are still struggling with digital transformation in different forms. And there's lots of elements to it. There's how do we influence the company? There are saboteurs out there that want to, for different reasons, maintain the status quo. And Stuart, you know all about this with your track record with digital, of moving companies to develop digital. But I think it's a really live topic. And I'm delighted that Ollie, I was speaking to yesterday, is going to join us, and he's going to talk about his experiences out in South Africa over the last 6 months or so. It's really interesting when you talk to him about how that mirrors what we've been finding in the UK. And indeed, Sam Ellis, who was on our diversity session earlier in the week, also would bear witness to this. Is not something unique to the UK at all. Everyone's struggling with it.
Yeah.
Your thoughts, Stuart, because you're the guru on this. You've done this. You know how this works. It's easy.
Well, I think digital transformation is quite a sort of misused term, and I think lots of company executives, when they think digital transformation, think technology, and I guess as someone who's been in this space for some, I guess, considerable time. Yes, there is obviously an element of technology, but at the heart of it, if you're going to be providing direct to consumer, whether that's business or personal customers services and products, then digital exposes your entire company. There's no hiding place. So if your processes are not fit for purpose, the business model, even the proposition, the product isn't fit for purpose, then digitizing it just ain't gonna work. Lipstick on a pig, right? Is the frame that's obviously used, and I just think so transformation. This is true transformation. That fact it might be about creating a digital service. Ultimately, you have to make sure your business is fit and right. So Maria, that you talked about, probably got this so wrong, right? And then obviously with any type of change program, then there's a whole raft of things you have to do to effectively manage change, right?
Yeah. And we all know there's so many change projects happened over the years in organisations. It's very difficult for people to be energetic for the next big change. It's one of the things we talked about in the employee section, actually. And this, I guess, so thank you, Maria, for that. And I think it also ties into the future of work discussions that we had a little while ago. What does that look like? And now we're combining everything here, because the future of work also has a big digital element to people, at home, but also AI coming on board. People having to rethink what work is, what jobs we're going to have to do, because during our lifetimes we've seen automation and things really change, and the future that everyone was seeing there was something that is here now, and it's developing very quickly. One of the key elements that came out of that future of work discussion was developing our people. So from that series, the future of work has now turned into a series of discussions. We'll be talking about designing employee development. So how do we look at that? How do we actually think about designing how we're going to develop our employees? There's some great statistics out on LinkedIn the other day about how much more beneficial it is to keep your employees and upskill them. So we're going to be looking at that, and we're going to be looking at how do you design that development. And I think with what's available to us now, we should be looking at designing that, not just jumping into it, not just giving it to a training department. I think now we have to look a lot more in depth about what we actually need. A lot of that conversation was about what skills do we actually need? What type of people do we actually need? What capabilities do they need? How do we develop those quickly in a different way? Maria, this feeds into some of your strengths really over the years. You've done a lot of work with in a call center world, with people learning and developing as they go through their working life.
Yeah, definitely. I think the whole design, iteration, deployment of how you bring somebody into the organization, and sort of moving from perhaps where some traditional organizations are at, which is a sort of adult-child relationship to development and training with their employee, to more of a sort of partnership. So, you know, thinking about the type of personality